The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, Part 1, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 8, Side 1. These laws offended every class, even the Puritans, who complained that the right of 3 children dangerously emancipated the mother from male authority. Others excused their celibacy on the score that the modern woman was too independent, imperious, capricious, and extravagant. The exclusion of bachelors from public shows was considered too severe and impossible to enforce. Augustus had the clause rescinded in 12 B.C. In AD 9, the Lex Papia Poppaea further softened the Julian laws by easing the conditions under which celibates might inherit, doubling the period in which widows and divorcees must remarry to inherit, and increasing the amount that childless heirs could receive. Mothers of 3 children were freed from those limits which the Lex Voconia of 169 B.C. had placed upon bequests to women. The age at which a citizen might stand for the various offices was lowered in proportion to the size of his family. After the law was passed, men noted that the consuls who had framed it and given it their names were childless celibates. Gossip added that the reform laws had been suggested to Augustus, who had only 1 child, by Maecenas, who had none, and that while the laws were being enacted, Maecenas was living in sybaritic luxury, and Augustus was seducing Maecenas' wife. It is difficult to estimate the effectiveness of this, the most important social legislation in antiquity. The laws were loosely drawn, and recalcitrants found many loopholes. Some men married to obey the law and divorced their wives soon afterwards. Others adopted children to secure offices or legacies, then emancipated, that is, dismissed them. Tacitus, a century later, pronounced the laws a failure. Marriages and the rearing of children did not become frequent, so powerful are the attractions of a childless state. Immorality continued, but was more polite than before. In Ovid we see it becoming a fine art, the subject of careful instructions from experts to apprentices. Augustus himself doubted the efficacy of his laws, and agreed with Horace that laws are vain when hearts are unchanged. He struggled heroically to reach people's hearts. In his box at the games he displayed the numerous children of the exemplary Germanicus, gave 1,000 sesterces to parents of large families, raised a monument to a slave girl who, doubtless without patriotic premeditation, had borne quintuplets, and rejoiced when a peasant marched into Rome with 8 children, 36 grandchildren, and 19 great-grandchildren in his train. Dio Cassius pictures him making public addresses denouncing race suicide. He enjoyed, perhaps inspired, the moral preface of Livy's history. Under his influence, the literature of the age became didactic and practical. Through Maecenas or in person, he persuaded Virgil and Horace to lend their muses to the propaganda of moral and religious reform. Virgil tried to sing the Romans back to the farm in the Georgics and to the old gods in the Aeneid. And Horace, after a large sampling of the world's pleasures, turned his lyre to Stoic themes. In 17 B.C., Augustus presented the Ludi Seculares, 3 days of ceremonies, contests, and spectacles, celebrating the return of Saturn's golden age. And Horace was commissioned to write the Carmen Seculare, to be chanted in procession by 27 boys and as many girls. Even art was used to point a moral. The lovely Ara Pacis showed in relief the life and government of Rome. Magnificent public buildings rose to represent the strength and glory of the empire. Scores of temples were erected to stir again a faith that had almost died. In the end, Augustus, skeptic and realist, became convinced that moral reform awaited a religious renaissance. The agnostic generation of Lucretius, Catullus, and Caesar had run its course, and its children had discovered that the fear of the gods is the youth of wisdom. Even the cynical Ovid would soon write, Voltairianly, Expedit esse Deos, et ut expedit esse putemus. It is convenient that there should be gods, and that we should think they exist. Conservative minds traced the Civil War and the sufferings it had brought to neglect of religion and the consequent anger of heaven. Everywhere in Italy a chastened people was ready to turn back to its ancient altars and thank the deities who, it felt, had spared it for this happy restoration. When in 12 B.C. Augustus, having waited patiently for the tepid Lepidus to die, succeeded him as Pontifex Maximus, such a multitude from all Italy assembled for my election, the emperor tells us, as is never recorded to have been in Rome before. He both led and followed the revival of religion, hoping that his political and moral reconstruction would win readier acceptance if he could entwine it with the gods. He raised the 4 priestly colleges to unprecedented dignity and wealth, chose himself to each of them, took upon himself the appointment of new members, attended their meetings faithfully, and took part in their solemn pageantry. He banned Egyptian and Asiatic cults from Rome, but he made an exception in favor of the Jews and permitted religious freedom in the provinces. He lavished gifts upon the temples and renewed old religious ceremonies, processions, and festivals. The ludi seculares were not secular. Every day of them was marked with religious ritual and song. Their chief significance was the return of a happy friendship with the gods. Nourished with such sovereign aid, the ancient cult took on fresh life and touched again the dramatic impulses and supernatural hopes of the people. Amid the chaos of competing faiths that flowed in upon Rome after Augustus, it held its own for 3 centuries more, and when it died it was at once reborn, under new symbols and new names. Augustus himself became one of the chief competitors of his gods. His great-uncle had set the example. 2 years after being murdered, Caesar had been recognized by the Senate as a deity, and his worship spread throughout the empire. As early as 36 BC, some Italian cities had given Octavian a place in their pantheon. By 27 BC, his name was added to those of the gods in official hymns at Rome. His birthday became a holy day as well as a holiday. And after his death, the Senate decreed that his genius, or soul, was thereafter to be worshipped as one of the official divinities. All this seemed quite natural to antiquity. It had never recognized an impassable difference between gods and men. The gods had often taken human form, and the creative genius of a Heracles, a Lycurgus, an Alexander, a Caesar, or an Augustus seemed, especially to the religious East, miraculous and divine. The Egyptians had thought of the pharaohs, of the Ptolemies, even of Antony as deities. They could hardly think less of Augustus. The ancients were not in these cases such simpletons as their modern counterparts would like to believe. They knew well enough that Augustus was human. In deifying his genius or that of others, they used deus or theos as equivalent to our canonized saint. Indeed, canonization is a descendant of Roman deification, and to pray to such a deified human being seemed no more absurd then than prayer to a saint seems now. In Italian homes, the worship of the emperor's genius became associated with the adoration given to the lares of the household and the genius of the paterfamilias. There was nothing difficult in this for a people which through centuries had deified their dead parents, built altars to them, and given the name of temples to the ancestral tombs. When Augustus visited Greek Asia in 21 BC, he found that his cult had made rapid headway there. Dedications and orations hailed him as Savior, bringer of glad tidings, God the Son of God. Some men argued that in him the long-awaited Messiah had come, bringing peace and happiness to mankind. The great provincial councils made his worship the center of their ceremonies. A new priesthood, the Augustales, was appointed by provinces and municipalities for the service of the new divinity. Augustus frowned upon all this, but finally accepted it as a spiritual enhancement of the principate, a valuable cementing of church and state, a uniting common worship amid diverse and dividing creeds. The moneylender's grandson consented to become a god. 5. Augustus himself. What sort of man was this who was heir to Caesar at 18, master of the world at 31, ruler of Rome for half a century, and architect of the greatest empire in ancient history? He was at once dull and fascinating, no one more prosaic, yet half the world adored him, a physical weakling, not particularly brave, but able to overcome all enemies, regulate kingdoms, and fashion a government that would give the vast realm an unexampled prosperity for 200 years. Sculptors spent much marble and bronze in making images of him, some showing him in the timid pride of a refined and serious youth, some in the somber pose of a priest, some half covered with the insignia of power, some in military garb, the philosopher unwillingly and uneasily playing the general. These effigies do not reveal, though sometimes they suggest, the ailments that made his war against chaos depend precariously at every step upon his fight for health. He was unprepossessing. He had sandy hair, a strangely triangular head, merging eyebrows, clear and penetrating eyes. Yet his expression was so calm and mild, says Suetonius, that a Gaul who came to kill him changed his mind. His skin was sensitive and intermittently itched with a kind of ringworm. Rheumatism weakened his left leg and made him limp a bit. A stiffness akin to arthritis occasionally incapacitated his right hand. He was one of many Romans attacked in 23 BC by a plague resembling typhus. He suffered from stones in the bladder and found it hard to sleep. He was troubled each spring by an enlargement of the diaphragm, and when the wind was in the south he had catarrh. He bore cold so poorly that in winter he wore a woolen chest protector, wraps for his thighs and shins, an undershirt, 4 tunics or blouses, and a heavy toga. He dared not expose his head to the sun. Horseback riding tired him, and he was sometimes carried in a litter to the battlefield. At 35, having lived through one of the most intense dramas in history, he was already old, nervous, sickly, easily tired. No one dreamed that he would live another 40 years. He tried a variety of doctors, and richly rewarded one, Antonius Musa, for curing an uncertain illness, abscess of the liver, with cold fomentations and baths. In Musa's honor he exempted all Roman physicians from taxation. But for the most part he doctored himself. He used hot salt water and sulphur baths for his rheumatism. He ate lightly and only the plainest food, coarse bread, cheese, fish, and fruit. He was so careful of his diet that sometimes he ate alone either before a dinner party or after it, taking nothing during its course. In him, as in some medieval saints, the soul bore its body like a cross. His essence was nervous vitality, inflexible resolution, a penetrating, calculating, resourceful mind. He accepted an unheard-of number of offices and took upon himself responsibility only less than Caesar's. He fulfilled the duties of these positions conscientiously, presided regularly over the Senate, attended innumerable conferences, judged hundreds of trials, suffered ceremonies and banquets, planned distant campaigns, governed legions and provinces, visited nearly every one of them, and attended to infinite administrative detail. He made hundreds of speeches and prepared them with proud attention to clarity, simplicity, and style. He read them instead of speaking extemporaneously, lest he should utter regrettable words. Suetonius would have us believe that for the same reason he wrote out in advance and read important conversations with individuals, even with his wife. Like most skeptics of his time, he retained superstitions long after losing his faith. He carried a sealskin about him to protect against lightning. He respected omens and auspices and sometimes obeyed warnings derived from dreams. He refused to begin a journey on what he reckoned to be unlucky days. At the same time, he was remarkable for the objectivity of his judgment and the practicality of his thought. He advised young men to enter soon upon an active career, so that the ideas they had learned from books might be tempered by the experience and necessities of life. He kept to the end his bourgeois good sense, conservatism, parsimony, and caution. Festina lente, make haste slowly, was his favorite saw. Far more than most men of such power, he could take advice and bear reproof humbly. Athenodorus, a philosopher who was returning to Athens after living with him for years, gave him some parting counsel. Whenever you get angry, do not say or do anything before repeating to yourself the 24 letters of the alphabet. Augustus was so grateful for the caution that he begged Athenodorus to stay another year, saying, "No risk attends the reward that silence brings." Even more surprising than Caesar's development from a roistering politician into a great general and statesman was the transformation of the merciless and self-centered Octavian into the modest and magnanimous Augustus. He grew. The man who had allowed Antony to hang Cicero's head in the Forum, who had moved without scruple from one faction to another, who had run the gamut of sexual indulgence, who had pursued Antony and Cleopatra to the death unmoved by friendship or chivalry. This tenacious and unlovable youth, instead of being poisoned by power, became in his last 40 years a model of justice, moderation, fidelity, magnanimity, and toleration. He laughed at the lampoons that wits and poets wrote about him. He advised Tiberius to be content with preventing or prosecuting hostile actions and not seek to suppress hostile words. He did not insist upon others living as simply as himself. When he invited guests to dinner, he would retire early to leave their appetite and merriment unrestrained. He had no pretentiousness. He buttonholed voters to ask their suffrages. He substituted for his lawyer friends in court. He left or entered Rome secretly, abhorring pomp. In the reliefs of the Ara Pacis, he is not set apart from the other citizens by any mark of distinction. His morning receptions were open to all citizens, and all were affably received. When one man hesitated to present a petition, he jokingly chided him for offering the document as if he were giving a penny to an elephant. In his senile years, when disappointments had embittered him, and he had grown accustomed to omnipotence, even to being a god, he lapsed into intolerance, prosecuted hostile writers, suppressed histories of too critical a stamp, and gave no ear to Ovid's penitent verse. Once it is said he had the legs of his secretary Thallus broken for taking 500 denarii to reveal the contents of an official letter. And he forced one of his freedmen to kill himself when found guilty of adultery with a Roman matron. All in all, it is hard to love him. We must picture the frailty of his body and the sorrows of his old age before our hearts can go out to him as to the murdered Caesar or the beaten Antony. 6. The Last Days of a God. His failures and his tragedies were almost all within his home. By his 3 wives, Claudia, Scribonia, Livia, he had but one child. Scribonia unwittingly avenged her divorce by giving him Julia. He had hoped that Livia would bear him a son whom he might train and educate for government, but though she rewarded her first husband with 2 splendid children, Tiberius and Drusus, her marriage with Augustus proved disappointingly sterile. Otherwise, their union was a happy one. She was a woman of stately beauty, firm character, and fine understanding. Augustus rehearsed his most vital measures with her and valued her advice as highly as that of his maturest friends. Asked how she had acquired such influence over him, she replied, by being scrupulously chaste, never meddling with his affairs and pretending neither to hear of nor to notice the favorites with whom he had amours. She was a model of the old virtues, and perhaps expounded them too persistently. In her leisure she devoted herself to charity, helping parents of large families, providing dowries for poor brides, and maintaining many orphans at her own expense. Her palace itself was almost an orphanage. For there, in the home of his sister Octavia, Augustus supervised the education of his grandsons, nephews, nieces, and even the 6 surviving children of Antony. He sent the boys off to early war, saw to it that the girls should learn to spin and weave, and forbade them to do or say anything except without concealment, and such as might be recorded in the household diary. Augustus learned to love Livia's son Drusus, adopted and reared him, and would gladly have left him his wealth and power. The youth's early death was one of the emperor's first bereavements. Tiberius he respected but could not love, for his future successor was a positive and imperious character, inclined to sullenness and secrecy. But the comeliness and vivacity of his daughter Julia must have given Augustus many happy moments in her childhood. When she had reached the age of 14, he persuaded Octavia to allow the divorce of her son Marcellus and induced the youth to marry Julia. 2 years later, Marcellus died, and Julia, after brief mourning, set out to enjoy a freedom she had long coveted. But soon the match-making emperor, craving a grandson as heir, coaxed the reluctant Agrippa to divorce his wife and marry the merry widow, this in 21 B.C. Julia was 18, Agrippa 42, but he was a good and great man and agreeably rich. She made his town house a salon of pleasure and wit, and became the soul of the younger and gayer set in the capital, as against the Puritans who took their lead from Livia. Rumor accused Julia of deceiving her new husband, and ascribed to her an incredible reply to the incredible question why, despite her adulteries, all the 5 children she gave Agrippa resembled him. Numquam nisi nave plena tolo vectorum. When Agrippa died in 12 B.C., Augustus turned his hopes to Julia's oldest sons, Gaius and Lucius, overwhelmed them with affection and education, and had them promoted to office far sooner than was legally warranted by their years. Again a widow, Julia, richer and lovelier than ever, entered with saucy abandon upon a succession of amours which became at once the scandal and joy of a Rome that fretted under the Julian laws. To quiet this gossip, and perhaps to reconcile his daughter with his wife, Augustus made a 3rd match for Julia. Livia's son Tiberius was compelled to divorce his pregnant wife, Vipsania Agrippina, daughter of Agrippa, and to marry the equally reluctant Julia, this in 9 B.C. The young old Roman did his best to be a good husband, but Julia soon gave up the effort to adjust her Epicurean to his Stoic ways, and resumed her illicit loves. Tiberius bore the infamy for a time in furious silence. The Lex Julia de Adulteriis required the husband of an adulteress to denounce her to the courts. Tiberius disobeyed the law to protect its author, and perhaps himself, for he and Livia had hoped that Augustus would adopt him as his son and transmit to him the leadership of the empire. When it became clear that the emperor favored instead Julia's children by Agrippa, Tiberius resigned his official posts and retired to Rhodes. There for 7 years he lived as a simple private citizen, devoting himself to solitude, philosophy, and astrology. Freer than ever, Julia passed from one lover to another, and the revels of her set filled the forum with turmoil at night. Augustus, now, in 2 B.C. an invalid of 60, suffered all that a father and ruler could bear from the simultaneous collapse of his family, his honor, and his laws. By these laws, the father of an adulteress was bound to indict her publicly if her husband had failed to do so. Proofs of her misconduct were laid before him, and the friends of Tiberius let it be known that unless Augustus acted, they would accuse Julia before the court. Augustus decided to anticipate them. While the merrymaking was at its height, he issued a decree banishing his daughter to the island of Pandateria, a barren rock off the Campanian coast. One of her lovers, a son of Antony, was forced to kill himself, and several others were exiled. Julia's freedwoman Phoebe hanged herself rather than testify against her. The distraught emperor, hearing of the act, said, "I would rather have been Phoebe's father than Julia's." The people of Rome begged him to forgive his daughter. Tiberius added his request to theirs, but pardon never came. Tiberius, enthroned, merely changed her place of residence to a less narrow confinement at Rhegium. There, broken and forgotten after 16 years of imprisonment, Julia died. Her sons Gaius and Lucius had long preceded her in death, Lucius of an illness in Marseille in AD 2, Gaius of a wound received in Armenia in AD 4. Left without aid or successor at a time when Germany, Pannonia, and Gaul were threatening revolt, Augustus reluctantly recalled Tiberius in AD 2, adopted him as son and co-regent, and sent him off to put down the rebellions. When he returned in AD 9, after 5 years of arduous and successful campaigning, all Rome, which hated him for his stern Puritanism, resigned itself to the fact that, though Augustus was still prince, Tiberius had begun to rule. Life's final tragedy is unwilling continuance, to outlive one's self and be forbidden to die. When Julia went into exile, Augustus was not in years an old man. Others were still vigorous at 60. But he had lived too many lives and died too many deaths since he had come to Rome, a boy of 18, to avenge Caesar's murder and execute his will. How many wars and battles and near defeats, how many pains and illnesses, how many conspiracies and perils, and bitter miscarriages of noble aims had befallen him in those crowded 42 years, and the snatching away of one hope and helper after another, until at last only this doer Tiberius remained. Perhaps it had been wiser to die like Antony, at the peak of life and in the arms of love. How sadly pleasant must have seemed in retrospect the days when Julia and Agrippa were happy, and grandchildren frolicked on the palace floor. Now another Julia, daughter of his daughter, had grown up and was following her mother's morals as if resolved to illustrate all the amatory arts of her friend Ovid's verse. In AD 8, having received proofs of her adultery, Augustus exiled her to an isle in the Adriatic, and at the same time banished Ovid to Tomi on the Black Sea. "Would that I had never married," mourned the feeble and shrunken emperor, "or that I had died without offspring." Sometimes he thought of starving himself to death. All the great structure that he had built seemed to be in ruins. The powers that he had assumed for order's sake had weakened into degeneration the Senate and the assemblies from which he had taken them. Tired of ratifications and adulations, the senators no longer came to their sessions, and a mere handful of citizens gathered in the comitia. Offices that had once stirred creative ambition by the power they brought were now shunned by the able as empty and expensive vanities. The very peace that Augustus had organized and the security that he had won for Rome had loosened the fiber of the people. No one wanted to enlist in the army or recognize the inexorable periodicity of war. Luxury had taken the place of simplicity, sexual license was replacing parentage. By its own exhausted will, the great race was beginning to die. All these things the old emperor keenly saw and sadly felt. No one then could tell him that despite 100 defects and half a dozen idiots on the throne, the strange and subtle principate that he had established would give the empire the longest period of prosperity ever known to mankind, and that the Pax Romana, which had begun as the Pax Augusta, would in the perspective of time be accounted the supreme achievement in the history of statesmanship. Like Leonardo, he thought that he had failed. Death came to him quietly at Nola in the 76th year of his age, AD 14. To the friends at his bedside he uttered the words often used to conclude a Roman comedy. "Since well I've played my part, clap now your hands, and with applause dismiss me from the stage." He embraced his wife, saying, "Remember our long union, Livia, farewell," and with this simple parting he passed away. Some days later his corpse was borne through Rome on the shoulders of senators to the field of Mars, and there cremated while children of high degree chanted the lament for the dead. Chapter 12. The Golden Age, 30 BC to AD 18. 1. The Augustan Stimulus. If peace and security are more favorable than war to the production of literature and art, yet war and profound social disturbances turn up the earth about the plants of thought and nourish the seeds that mature in peace. A quiet life does not make great ideas or great men, but the compulsions of crisis, the imperatives of survival, weed out dead things by the roots and quicken the growth of new ideas and ways. Peace after successful war has all the stimulus of a rapid convalescence. Men then rejoice at mere being, and sometimes break into song. The Romans were grateful to Augustus because he had cured, even if by a major operation, the cancer of chaos that had been consuming their civic life. They were astonished to find themselves rich so soon after devastation, and they were elated to note that despite their recent defenseless disorder, they were still masters of what seemed to them the world. They looked back upon their history, from the first to this second Romulus, from creator to restorer, and judged it epically wonderful. They were hardly surprised when Virgil and Horace put their gratitude, their glory, and their pride into verse, and Livy into prose. Better still, the region they had conquered was only partly barbarous. A large area of it was the realm of Hellenistic culture, of refined speech, subtle literature, enlightening science, mature philosophy, and noble art. This spiritual wealth was now pouring into Rome, stirring imitation and rivalry, compelling language and letters to spruce up and grow. 10,000 Greek words slipped into the Latin vocabulary, 10,000 Greek statues or paintings entered Roman forums, temples, streets, and homes. Money was passing down, even to poets and artists, from the captors of Egypt's treasury, the absentee owners of Italy's soil, and the exploiters of the empire's resources and trade. Writers dedicated their works to rich men in the hope of receiving gifts that would finance their further toil. So Horace addressed his odes to Sallust, Aelius Lamia, Manlius Torquatus, and Munatius Plancus. Messala Corvinus gathered about him a coterie of authors whose star was Tibullus, and Maecenas redeemed his wealth in poetry by presents to Virgil, Horace, and Propertius. Until his final irascible years, Augustus followed a liberal policy toward literature. He was glad to have letters and art take up the energies that had disturbed politics. He would pay men to write books if they would let him govern the state. His generosity to poets became so renowned that a swarm of them buzzed around him wherever he went. When a Greek persisted day after day in pressing verses into his hand as he left his palace, Augustus retaliated by stopping, composing some lines of his own, and having an attendant give them to the Greek. The latter offered the emperor a few denarii and expressed his regret that he could not give more. Augustus rewarded his wit, not his poetry, with 100,000 sesterces. The stream of books swelled now to proportions unknown before. Everyone from fool to philosopher wrote poetry. Since all poetry and most literary prose were designed to be read aloud, gatherings were formed at which authors read their productions to invited or general audiences, or, in rare moments of tolerance, to one another. Juvenal thought that a compelling reason for living in the country was to escape the poets who infested Rome. In the bookshops that crowded a district called the Argiletum, writers assembled to compute literary genius, while impecunious bibliophiles furtively read snatches of the books they could not buy. Placards on the walls announced new titles and their cost. Small volumes sold for 4 or 5 sesterces, average volumes for 10, or $1.50. Elegant editions like Martial's epigrams, usually illustrated with a portrait of the author, brought some 5 denarii, or $3. Books were exported to all parts of the empire, or were published simultaneously in Rome, Lyon, Athens, and Alexandria. Martial was pleased to learn that he was bought and sold in Britain. Even poets now had private libraries. Ovid affectionately describes his. We gather from Martial that there were already book fanciers who collected deluxe editions or rare manuscripts. Augustus established 2 public libraries. Tiberius, Vespasian, Domitian, Trajan, and Hadrian built others. By the 4th century there were 28 in Rome. Foreign students and writers came to study in these libraries and in public archives. So Dionysius came from Halicarnassus, and Diodorus from Sicily. Rome was now the rival of Alexandria as the literary center of the Western world. This efflorescence transformed both literature and society. Letters and the arts took on new dignity. Grammarians lectured on living authors. People sang snatches from them in the streets. Writers mingled with statesmen and high-born ladies in luxurious salons such as history would never know again until the flowering of France. The aristocracy became literary, literature became aristocratic. The lusty vigor of Ennius and Plautus, Lucretius and Catullus was exchanged for a delicate beauty or a teasing complexity in expression and thought. Writers ceased to mingle with the people, ceased therefore to describe their ways or speak their language. A divorce set in between literature and life that finally sucked the sap and spirit out of Latin letters. Forms were set by Greek models, themes by Greek tradition or Augustus's court. Poetry, when it could spare time from theocracy and shepherds or anacreontic love, was to sing didactically the joys of agriculture, the morality of ancestors, the glory of Rome, and the splendor of its gods. Literature became a handmaiden of statesmanship, a polyphonic sermon calling the nation to Augustan ideas. Two forces opposed this conscription of letters by the state. One was Horace's hated and profane crowd, which liked the salty tang and independence of the old satires and plays rather than the curled and perfumed beauty of the new. The other was that demimonde of jollity and sin to which Clodia and Julia belonged. This younger set was in full rebellion against the Julian laws, wanted no moral reform, had its own poets, circles, and norms. In letters, as in life, the two forces fought each other, crossing in Tibullus and Propertius, matching the chaste piety of Virgil with the obscene audacities of Ovid, crushing two Julias and one poet with exile, and at last exhausting each other in the Silver Age. But the ferment of great events, the releasing leisure of wealth and peace, the majesty of a world acknowledging Rome's sway, overcame the corrosion of state subsidies and produced a golden age whose literature was the most perfect in form and utterance in all the memory of men. 2. Virgil. The most lovable of Romans was born in 70 B.C. on a farm near Mantua, where the river Mincio wanders slowly toward the Po. The capital would henceforth give birth to very few great Romans. They would come from Italy in the century that was divided by the birth of Christ, and thereafter from the provinces. Perhaps Virgil's veins contained some Celtic blood, for Mantua had long been peopled by Gauls. Technically, he was a Gaul by birth, for it was only 21 years later that Cisalpine Gaul received the Roman franchise from Caesar. The man who most eloquently sang the majesty and destiny of Rome would never show the hard masculinity of the Roman stock, but would touch Celtic strings of mysticism, tenderness, and grace rare in the Roman breed. His father saved enough as a court clerk to buy a farm and raise bees. In that murmurous quietude the poet spent his boyhood. The full foliage of the well-watered north lingered in his later memory, and he was never really happy away from those fields and streams. At 12 he was sent to school at Cremona, at 14 to Milan, at 16 to Rome. There he studied rhetoric and allied subjects under the same man who was to teach Octavian. Probably after this he attended the lectures of Ciro the Epicurean at Naples. Virgil tried hard to accept the philosophy of pleasure, but his rural background had ill-equipped him. He seems to have returned north after his education, for in 41 B.C. we find him swimming for life to escape a soldier who seized by force his father's farm. Octavian and Antony had confiscated it because the region had favored their enemies. Asinius Pollio, the learned governor of Cisalpine Gaul, tried to have the farm returned but failed. He atoned by giving his patronage to the young man and encouraging him to continue the eclogues he was composing. By the year 37, Virgil was drinking in the wine of fame in Rome. The eclogues, or selections, had just been published and had been well received. Some verses had been recited on the stage by an actress and had been enthusiastically applauded. The poems were pastoral sketches in the manner, sometimes the phrases, of Theocritus, beautiful in style and rhythm, the most melodious hexameters that Rome had yet heard, full of pensive tenderness and romantic love. The youth of the capital had been long enough detached from the soil to idealize country life. Everyone was pleased to imagine himself a shepherd moving with his flocks up and down the Apennine slopes and breaking his heart with love unreturned. Realer than these Theocritan ghosts were the rural scenes. Here, too, Virgil idealized, but he did not have to imitate. He had heard the woodman's lusty song and the hovering restlessness of bees, and he had known the empty-hearted despair of the farmer who, like thousands then, had lost his land. Above all, he felt intensely the hopes of the age for an end to faction and war. The Sibylline books had predicted that after the age of iron, the golden age of Saturn would return. When in 40 B.C. a son was born to Virgil's patron, Asinius Pollio, the poet announced in his fourth eclogue that this birth would usher in utopia. Now comes the final age announced in the Cumaean Sibyl's chant. The great succession of epochs is born anew. Now the Virgin returns, the reign of Saturn returns. Now a new race descends from heaven on high. O chaste Lucina, goddess of births, smile upon the boy just born, in whose time the race of iron shall first cease, and a race of gold shall arise throughout the world. Thine own Apollo is now king. 10 years later these prophecies were fulfilled. The iron tools of war were laid aside. A new generation took charge, armed and infatuated with gold. Through the brief remainder of Virgil's life, Rome would know no further turmoil. Prosperity and happiness increased, and Augustus was hailed as a savior, though not an Apollo. The quasi-royal court welcomed the optimism of the poet's verse. Maecenas invited him, liked him, and saw in him a popular instrument of Octavian's reforms. This judgment showed insight, for to all appearances Virgil, now 33, was an awkward rustic, shy to the point of stammering, shunning any public place where he might be recognized and pointed out, ill at ease in the voluble and aggressive fashionable society of Rome. Besides, even more than Octavian, he was an invalid, suffering from headaches, throat ailments, stomach disorders, and frequent spitting of blood. Virgil never married and seems to have felt no more than his Aeneas the full abandon of love. Apparently he consoled himself for a time with the affection of a boy slave. For the rest he was known at Naples as the Virgin. Maecenas treated the youth generously, had Octavian restore his farm, and suggested to him some poems glorifying agricultural life. At that moment, 37 B.C., Italy was paying a penalty for letting so much of her soil go to pasturage, orchards, and vines. Sextus Pompey was blocking the import of food from Sicily and Africa, and a shortage of grain threatened another revolution. City life was enervating the young manhood of Italy. From every standpoint, the health of the nation seemed to require the restoration of farming. Virgil readily agreed. He knew rural life, and though too frail now to bear its hardships, he was just the man to paint its attractive features with affectionate memory. He hid himself in Naples, and after 7 years of file work emerged with his most perfect poems, the Georgics, literally the labor of the land. Maecenas was delighted and brought Virgil south with him to meet Octavian, then, in 29 B.C., returning from his victory over Cleopatra. At the little town of Atella, the weary general rested and listened for 4 enchanted days to the 2,000 lines. They fell in with his policies more completely than even Maecenas had foreseen. For he proposed now to disband the larger part of the immense armies that had won the world for him, to settle his veterans on the land and at once to quiet them, feed the cities, and preserve the state through rural toil. From that moment Virgil was free to think only of poetry. In the Georgics, a great artist deals with the noblest of the arts, the cultivation of the earth. Virgil borrows from Hesiod, Aratus, Cato, Varro, but he transforms their rough prose or limping lines into finely chiseled verse. He covers dutifully the diverse branches of husbandry, the variety and treatment of soils, the seasons for sowing and reaping, the culture of the olive and the vine, the raising of cattle, horses, and sheep, and the care of bees. Every aspect of farming interests and beguiles him. He has to caution himself to get on. But meanwhile time flies irreparably, while we, charmed with love of our theme, linger around each single detail. He has a word about the diseases of animals and how to treat them. He describes the common farm animals with understanding and sympathy. He is never through admiring the simplicity of their instincts, the power of their passions, the perfection of their forms. He idealizes rural life, but he does not ignore the hardships and vicissitudes, the crippling toil, the endless struggle against insects, the torturing pendulum of drought and storm. Nevertheless, labor omnia vincit. There is in such toil a purpose and result that give it dignity. No Roman need feel ashamed to guide a plow. Moral character, says Virgil, grows on the farm. All the old virtues that made Rome great were planted and nourished there, and hardly any process of seed-sowing, protection, cultivation, weeding, and harvesting but has its counterpart in the development of the soul. And out of the fields where the miracle of growth and the whims of the sky bespeak 1,000 mystic forces, the soul, more readily than in the city, perceives the presence of creative life and is deepened with religious intuition, humility, and reverence. Here Virgil breaks into his most famous lines, beginning with a noble echo of Lucretius, but passing into a pure Virgilian strain. Happy the man who has been able to learn the causes of things, and has put underfoot all fear and inexorable fate, and the noise of a greedy hell. But happy, too, he who knows the rural deities, Pan, and old Silvanus, and the sister nymphs. The peasant is right in seeking to propitiate the gods with sacrifice, and enlist their goodwill. These exercises of piety brighten the round of toil with festivals and clothe earth and life with meaning, drama, and poetry. Dryden considered the Georgics the best poem of the best poet. It shares with the De Rerum Natura the rare distinction of being at once didactic and beautiful. Rome did not take it seriously as a handbook of agriculture. We do not hear that anyone, having read it, exchanged the forum for a farm. Indeed, as Seneca thought, Virgil may have written these rural ecstasies precisely to please an urban taste. In any case, Augustus felt that Virgil had performed Maecenas' assignment marvelously well. He called the poet to his palace and suggested a harder task, a vastly larger theme. 3. The Aeneid. At first the plan was to sing the battles of Octavian, but the supposed descent of his adoptive father from Venus and Aeneas led the poet, perhaps the emperor, to conceive an epic on the founding of Rome. As the theme developed, it came to include, by preview through prophecy, the expansion of Rome into the Augustan Empire and peace. It would also show the role of Roman character in these achievements and seek to make the ancient virtues popular. It would picture its hero as reverent of the gods and guided by them, and would fall in with the Augustan reformation of morals and faith. Virgil retired to various lairs in Italy and spent the next 10 years, from 29 to 19, on the Aeneid. He wrote slowly, with the devotion of a Flaubert, dictating a few lines in the fresh morning and rewriting them in the afternoon. Augustus waited impatiently for the poem's completion, repeatedly inquired about its progress, and importuned Virgil to bring him any finished fragment. Virgil put him off as long as he could, but finally read to him the 2nd, 4th, and 6th books. Octavia, Antony's widow, fainted at the passage describing her son Marcellus, but lately dead. The epic was never completed and never finally revised. In 19 B.C., Virgil visited Greece, met Augustus in Athens, was sunstruck in Megara, started home, and died soon after reaching Brundisium. On his deathbed, he begged his friends to destroy the manuscript of his poem, saying that at least 3 years more would have been necessary to give it finished form. Augustus forbade them to carry out the request. Every schoolboy knows the story of the Aeneid. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.